The sea stood before us, wide and unmoving. Behind us, the dust of Pharaoh's chariots rose like a storm. I could hear the wheels before I could see them. The people pressed closer, fear spreading faster than fire through dry grass. There was nowhere left to turn. I held the staff in my hand, but wood feels small when a nation looks to you for deliverance. If the Lord does not act now, we are finished. The cries began to rise around me. Mothers clutching children, men staring back toward the horizon in disbelief. Were there no graves in Egypt, they shouted? I felt their fear strike like blows against my back. I had led them out with bold words and signs from heaven. Now the sea blocked our path, and Pharaoh's army closed in. Leadership feels different when faith is tested by the sound of approaching iron. I could see the doubt in their eyes. The same people who walked out of Egypt under the weight of plagues now trembled at the sight of chariots. The sea did not part. The wind had not yet moved. For a moment, even I felt the weight of silence. I had spoken for God before kings. Now I stood between water and war. Faith is loud in freedom. It is quieter when death feels near. The people pressed against me with accusations. It would have been better to serve than to die here, they said. I heard the fear beneath their anger. Slavery feels safer than uncertainty when the future looks like a wall of water. I turned toward them and steadied my voice. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. The words left my mouth before the sea moved. I spoke faith into windless air. I told them they would see deliverance. I told them the Egyptians they feared would never be seen again. The confidence in my voice had to be stronger than the trembling in their hearts. Yet inside, I waited. I had seen rivers turn to blood. I had watched darkness swallow Egypt. But the sea before us remained unbroken. There is a silence between promise and movement that tests a man more than any army. I turned away from the noise of the people and cried out to the Lord. The wind carried sand against my face as if the desert itself were listening. The chariots grew louder. I did not ask for spectacle. I asked for intervention. Then the answer came, not as thunder, but as command. Why do you cry to me? The question struck deeper than the fear around us. The time for pleading had ended. It was time to move. Tell the people to go forward. The command did not match the scene before us. The sea still stretched wide and unbroken, the army still closing behind with relentless speed. Yet the instruction was unmistakable. I felt the staff in my hand grow heavier, not with wood, but with responsibility. Faith is not proven when the way is visible. It is proven when obedience comes before evidence. I inhaled deeply and stepped toward the impossible. I lifted the staff over the sea. The wind had not yet risen. The waters did not tremble. Behind us the sound of iron and hooves pressed closer, tightening every breath in the camp. I stood there with my arm extended, exposed before a nation and an army. If nothing happens now, I thought, their fear will be justified. Obedience sometimes feels like standing still in front of disaster. Then the wind began, not sudden, not violent at first. It started as a low, steady force, pushing against my robes and driving sand across the ground. The surface of the sea shivered under its breath. The people fell silent behind me. The army still advanced, unaware. I did not lower my arm. I watched the water respond to a command none of us could see. When God moves, it often begins where only the obedient are looking. The wind strengthened until it roared across the water, driving it back inch by inch. What had been a barrier began to shift under unseen force. I watched the sea recoil, as though pressed by a hand greater than any storm. The ground beneath it slowly emerged, dark and wet at first, then firm. The people gasped behind me. The armies still advanced. A path was forming, but the danger had not vanished. The waters did not simply retreat. They rose. On both sides they stood like walls held in place by breath alone. The wind did not cease. It pressed against my back, as if urging us forward. I stepped onto ground that hours before had been sea. It held, firm, impossible. I turned and signaled the people to move. Faith had become visible, but the army was still coming. Deliverance had opened, but we had to walk into it. They hesitated at first. Walls of water loomed on either side, shifting under the pressure of the wind. Children clung to their mothers. Elders stared upward in awe and terror. I walked further into the path, each step a declaration that the ground would hold. When the first families followed, the sound changed from panic to movement. The sea had opened, but trust still had to cross. The people moved slowly at first, unsure whether the ground beneath their feet would remain solid. The walls of water towered on either side, shifting and trembling under the force of the wind. I could hear children crying, animals restless, elders whispering prayers. The night swallowed the horizon ahead. I walked deeper into the path, aware that obedience had opened it, but perseverance would carry us through. The wind did not relent. It howled through the passage, pressing the water back as though holding breath for an entire nation. I walked between walls that shimmered in the darkness, their weight unimaginable, restrained only by the word of the Lord. Every step forward felt both miraculous and fragile. Behind us, I could still hear the distant thunder of chariots. Freedom was forming, but it had not yet been secured. We were not yet across when the sound behind us changed. The chariots had entered the passage. I turned and saw torches flickering against the walls of water, reflections trembling along the surface like fire trapped inside glass. Pharaoh's army had chosen to follow the path meant for our escape. Fear threatened to rise again among the people, but I held my ground. The sea had opened by command. It would close the same way. The Egyptians pressed forward with confidence, their wheels cutting into the seabed we had just crossed. But something shifted. I could see confusion ripple through their ranks. The ground that felt firm beneath us began to resist them. Wheels dragged, horses strained, torches wavered in unstable air. The same wind that cleared our path now seemed to fight against them. Deliverance is not only about opening, it is also about distinction. The noise of pursuit grew uneven. What had been thunder became disorder. I heard shouting echo between the walls of water. "The Lord fights for them," some cried. The words carried over the wind and struck my chest with strange calm. We had walked through fear. They had chased power. The difference was no longer subtle. I knew the moment was approaching when obedience would require one final act. When the last of our people reached the opposite shore, I stood facing the sea once more. Behind me, a nation trembling with exhaustion. Before me, an army trapped between walls they did not command. The wind still roared, holding everything in suspended tension. I knew what must be done. The staff in my hand no longer felt uncertain. It felt appointed. Deliverance had opened the path. Judgment would now close it. The command came again, steady and unmistakable. I lifted the staff toward the sea, not in desperation this time, but in obedience fulfilled. The wind began to shift direction. The walls that had stood firm through the night trembled with restrained force. I could hear the panic within the passage grow louder. Horses reared, men shouted. What had been a corridor of escape was about to become something else entirely. The waters collapsed with a force no human voice could command. The walls gave way, folding inward as the wind ceased its restraint. The sound was not merely loud, it was final. The sea rushed back into its place, swallowing torches, iron and ambition alike. I did not cheer, I did not move. I stood watching the surface close, knowing that the same power that opened a path had now sealed our deliverance. When the sea settled, an unnatural silence followed. The wind that had roared all night withdrew as if its work were complete. The horizon where chariots once advanced was now only water again calm, vast, undisturbed. I turned slowly toward the people. Their faces reflected shock more than celebration. Deliverance had come, but it had come with weight. Freedom is louder in promise than in aftermath. The people moved cautiously toward the shoreline, searching the water as though expecting the army to rise again. Instead, the sea returned what it had taken. Armor drifted. Broken chariot wheels washed ashore. The power that once defined Egypt lay scattered at our feet. I watched them look from the wreckage to the sea, then back to me. Fear had not vanished. It had changed direction. They stood at the shore, staring at the water that only hours before had been a wall of impossibility. The same sea that blocked our escape had become the instrument of our freedom. I saw something shift in their eyes, not just relief, but reverence. Fear of Pharaoh had ruled them for generations. Now that fear was broken, what replaces fear when it falls? Awe, and awe changes a nation more deeply than panic ever could. The morning light began to rise over the horizon, faint and cautious, revealing faces that had crossed through terror and emerged alive. I looked back once more at the sea, now calm, as though nothing had happened. Yet everything had happened. Chains had broken without a sword raised. An empire had been humbled without a battle fought by our hands. The Lord had fought for us just as he said he would. The people began to speak in hushed tones, recounting what they had seen, as though afraid the memory might fade if not repeated. I watched fathers lift their children and point toward the sea, explaining that the path we crossed had not always been there. This would not be forgotten. Not by us, not by our children. Deliverance that reshapes history must also reshape identity. We were no longer fugitives. We were a people led. I stood apart for a moment, letting the sound of the sea settle into something ordinary again. My arm, which had remained raised through wind and command, now felt heavy with memory. I had argued with the Lord before, questioned my own calling, feared my own inadequacy. Yet here we stood, live on the other side of what seemed impossible. The burden of leadership had not crushed me. It had been carried with me. The people looked at me differently now. Not as the man who once fled Egypt, not as the shepherd from Midian. They looked at me as the one who stretched out his hand over the sea. But I knew better. The staff in my hand was wood. The wind was not mine to command. Authority had passed through me, not from me. A leader must remember that, or deliverance turns into pride. I remembered the first time I stood before Pharaoh. Uncertain and reluctant, my voice trembling despite the calling upon my life. I remembered arguing with God in the wilderness, insisting that I was not enough. And now I stood before a sea that had obeyed a command spoken through my obedience. The journey from hesitation to authority had not been smooth. It had been carved through doubt, resistance, and surrender. The sea behind us now looked ordinary, as though it had never parted at all. That is how miracles often appear once they are complete quiet, almost concealed within normalcy. But I would never look at water the same way again. What had once represented barrier and fear had become witness and weapon. The Lord had not removed the sea, he had used it. And that truth would remain with me longer than the wind itself. I watched as the first voices began to rise, not in panic this time, but in praise. It started quietly, almost uncertain, then grew stronger as memory replaced fear. The same mouths that accused me hours before now declared the power of the Lord. I did not silence them. I joined them. Leadership is not only about standing firm in crisis. It is about directing gratitude when deliverance comes. The sound of praise spread across the shore like a second wind, rising where fear had once dominated. I could see tears on faces that had expected death before nightfall. Children who had clung in terror now ran along the edge of the sea, alive because the Lord had made a way. I lifted my eyes toward the horizon, not in triumph, but in humility. The sea had obeyed him, and so must we. The memory of the night would remain with us long after the wind faded. We would speak of the walls of water and the ground that held beneath our feet. But I knew the greater miracle was not the sea itself. It was the transformation in the hearts of the people. Fear had ruled them for generations. Now they had seen what faith could look like when obedience stands still before the impossible. I knew the wilderness still lay ahead. The sea had not ended our journey. It had only begun it. Freedom is not the absence of obstacles. It is the presence of the Lord in the midst of them. The same people who sang this morning would one day doubt again. I understood that. I had doubted too. But something irreversible had happened at the water's edge. We had seen deliverance with our own eyes. As the people gathered themselves and prepared to move again, I felt the weight of what had occurred settle deep within me. This was not merely escape from Egypt, it was separation. The sea had drawn a line no chariot could cross. Behind us lay bondage. Before us lay wilderness and promise. I tightened my grip on the staff, aware that miracles open paths, but leadership must guide what comes next. I turned once more toward the sea before we departed. The surface reflected the rising light, calm and undisturbed, concealing the memory of what had happened beneath it. I realized then that deliverance leaves no monument but memory. There would be no stone pillar here, no altar built from parted waters, only the story carried in the mouths of a people who had walked through the impossible and lived. The journey would not grow easier after this. Hunger would test us, thirst would expose impatience. The wilderness has a way of revealing what miracles cannot permanently silence. Yet the memory of the sea would remain a foundation beneath every complaint. When doubt rose, I would remember the wind. When fear returned, I would remember the walls of water. What the Lord begins, He sustains. I understood something deeper that morning. The sea had not moved because of my strength, nor because the people believed perfectly. It moved because the Lord had determined to reveal Himself. I was merely the hand that lifted the staff. Authority feels heavy when misunderstood. If I ever forgot that the power belonged to Him, the wilderness would remind me quickly. Deliverance begins in obedience and remains in humility. The sound of the sea faded behind us as we began to walk toward the unknown. The pillar of cloud moved ahead, steady and guiding, as it had since we left Egypt. I did not know the full path before us, only the direction. Leadership is not seeing the entire map. It is following when the Lord moves. The same hand that opened the waters would lead us through the wilderness. As we left the shoreline behind, I felt the weight of responsibility settle again upon my shoulders. The miracle had silenced fear for a moment, but the journey would demand more than awe. It would demand endurance. I looked at the people walking ahead, families, elders, children, and understood that what happened at the sea was not only rescue, it was revelation. The Lord had shown us who He is. Now we must learn to trust Him daily. I will never forget the sound of the wind against the sea, or the sight of water standing where none should stand. But what remains with me most is not the spectacle, it is the obedience. I raised the staff before the waters moved. I stepped forward before the path appeared. The Lord fought for us, just as He said. And on that shore between fear and freedom, I was there.